I still remember the sound it made. The sharp, crystalline crack of the wine glass tipping against the edge of the table, the splash that followed like a small dying gasp, and the impossible silence that descended right after, heavy and suffocating, as though the air itself had stopped breathing. The red wine spread across the white tablecloth like blood through linen, seeping, blooming, alive. For one terrible second, I thought maybe, just maybe, it hadn't touched him. But when I looked up, when my eyes met the man sitting before me, the one everyone in the restaurant had been whispering about since the moment he walked in, I saw it. The dark red stain ran down the front of his pristine white shirt, rich and slow like a wound that refused to close, and I could feel my stomach twist into a knot so tight I could barely breathe. He didn't move at first. He just sat there, perfectly still, his hand resting on the stem of his untouched wine glass, his fingers long and pale and deceptively elegant. His eyes, gray, cold, impossibly calm, lifted to mine, and it felt like standing in front of a train that hadn't decided yet whether to stop or run me over. No one said a word. The restaurant, once buzzing with soft chatter and clinking silverware, became a tomb. The jazz band in the corner stopped playing mid-note. The waiter behind me froze with a bottle of champagne half raised, and somewhere I swear I could hear the faintest sound of my own heart breaking into uneven beats. I opened my mouth to apologize, to beg, to do something. Anything, but my throat betrayed me. The words wouldn't come out. He finally set down his glass, slowly, deliberately, as though time itself obeyed his rhythm. And then he smiled. Not a kind smile, not even a cruel one, but something darker, quieter, the kind of smile a wolf might give before deciding whether it's hungry. "You owe me," he said softly. His voice was low, smooth, but there was something in it. Steel wrapped in velvet, danger hiding in politeness, that made my knees go weak. I nodded before I even realized it, my voice trembling when I whispered, "I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, just one, and I stopped talking as if he'd pressed a finger to my lips. "No," he said, his tone measured, calm. "You will be." And then, just like that, he stood. The chair slid back with a sound that sliced through the silence, and his men, because that's what they were, even if they were dressed like lawyers and models, rose with him, forming a quiet wall of black suits and unreadable faces. He didn't look back at me as he left. He didn't have to. Everyone else did. It was like the air only remembered how to move again after he walked out the door. My manager came rushing over, his face pale and drawn, his voice low and frantic as he hissed, "Do you have any idea who that was?" I shook my head because, in truth, I didn't. Not really. I'd heard his name once or twice, whispered in the kind of tones reserved for urban legends and cautionary tales. Luca DeLuca. The DeLuca family. The kind of people you didn't cross, didn't look at too long, didn't even think about unless you wanted trouble finding you. "That's him," my manager said, running a shaking hand through his thinning hair. "That's the Luca." Jesus Christ, girl, what were you thinking? I wanted to tell him I hadn't been thinking at all, that my hands had been trembling from exhaustion, that it was my second week on the job and I hadn't slept more than 4 hours in days, that I'd been balancing too many tables and too many worries, that the universe just had a cruel sense of humor. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was that I had spilled wine on a Mafia boss, and that he said I owed him. When my shift ended, I stayed behind, pretending to clean up. But really, I was just trying to steady my breathing. The clock ticked loud enough to drown out my thoughts. My hands still smelled faintly of Cabernet and bleach. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those gray eyes staring back at me, patient and predatory. By the time I walked home through the damp streets, the city felt different, heavier, as though it too knew I'd made a mistake that couldn't be undone. My apartment was small, cramped, with flickering lights and a view of a brick wall. But that night, it felt like a sanctuary. I double-locked the door, tossed my shoes in the corner, and tried to laugh it off. "It's fine," I whispered to myself. "He's not going to do anything. It was just an accident." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. I made tea I didn't drink, scrolled through social media I didn't see, and finally, when my eyelids grew heavy, I fell asleep on the couch, still in my work uniform. The knock came just past midnight. 3 sharp raps, precise, confident, without hesitation. I froze. For a moment, I thought maybe it was a neighbor, maybe a delivery mistake, maybe anything but what my gut already knew. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole, and my stomach dropped. A man stood there, tall, dressed in black, his hands clasped neatly in front of him. His face was expressionless, his hair slicked back, his jaw clean and sharp as glass. He looked like the kind of man who didn't need to say much to be terrifying. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, heart pounding, until he spoke. "Miss..." He paused, glancing down at something, then continued. "Carter? Mr. DeLuca sent me." My mouth went dry. "Why?" He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel safe. "You owe him." Those were the same words Luca had said in the restaurant, and hearing them again, delivered so calmly, so casually, as if they were simply fact, made my skin prickle. He can't possibly..." He cut me off with a small shrug. "He'd like to see you. Tonight." I looked at the clock. Midnight. Now? Now. I hesitated, torn between slamming the door and asking the 1,000 questions clawing at my throat, but something deeper, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite curiosity, made me pause. "What happens if I say no?" I asked quietly. The man tilted his head slightly, considering, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite. "Then we'll come back tomorrow. But it won't be as friendly." And there it was. The truth laid bare, as cold and clear as the night air, leaking through the cracks in my window. I didn't know what terrified me more, the thought of what might happen if I went, or the thought of what might happen if I didn't. So I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and followed him into the darkness, my pulse hammering so loudly I could barely hear the sound of my own footsteps. The black car waiting at the curb gleamed under the streetlight like a sleeping beast. The driver opened the door for me, and I hesitated for just a second, long enough to wonder if this was the moment my life would split into before and after. And as the door shut behind me, sealing me inside the dim, leather-scented interior, I realized that maybe it already had. The car smelled of leather, power, and something faintly metallic. The kind of scent that didn't belong to any one person but to a certain kind of life. The kind built on silence, wealth, and danger. I sat in the back seat, my hands clenched tightly together, my pulse a frantic whisper in my ears as the city blurred past outside the tinted windows. I didn't ask where we were going, because some part of me already knew that it didn't matter. When a man like Luca DeLuca sent for you, the destination wasn't something you questioned. It was something you survived. The driver didn't speak, not once, and the longer the silence stretched between us, the louder my thoughts became. I kept seeing his face, those gray eyes, that unreadable smile, the way his voice had curled around those 2 words like a promise and a threat all at once. "You owe me." It had sounded so simple, almost playful, but I had the sinking feeling that with him, nothing was ever simple, and nothing was ever a game unless he decided it was. We drove for what felt like forever before the car finally slowed, pulling up in front of a restaurant I didn't recognize. Sleek, dark, too elegant for words, the kind of place where the menu had no prices because if you had to ask, you didn't belong there. The driver got out, opened my door, and nodded toward the entrance. He's waiting inside. The night air was cool against my skin, but my palms were damp. I took a deep breath and stepped out, my heels clicking against the marble as I entered. The place was nearly empty, save for one table at the far end, lit by a single golden light that made everything around it seem to fade into shadow. He sat there, alone, a dark silhouette framed against the dim glow of the city beyond the glass walls. His jacket hung on the chair beside him, his shirt crisp and unbuttoned at the collar, his posture both relaxed and predatory, like a lion pretending to be tame. When he looked up, it was like the rest of the world stopped existing for a moment. "Miss Carter," he said softly, and the sound of my name in his mouth made something in my chest tighten. "Sit." I hesitated for only a second before doing as he asked. The chair creaked slightly as I lowered myself into it, my hands folded neatly in my lap like a schoolgirl summoned to the principal's office. He watched me for a long time, saying nothing, his gaze steady, unreadable, the kind of stare that made you want to confess things you hadn't even done. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You're not very good at staying out of trouble," he said, and though there was a ghost of amusement in his tone, his eyes remained cold. "It was an accident," I managed, my voice smaller than I intended. He smiled, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the word. "There are no accidents, only consequences." I swallowed hard. "If you want me to pay for the shirt, I can—" He chuckled, low and quiet, and the sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "Do you really think I brought you here over a shirt?" I didn't know what to say to that. He gestured to the waiter, who appeared as if conjured from the shadows, and within seconds a glass of red wine was placed in front of me, the same kind I had spilled on him. I stared at it, unsure whether it was meant as a test or a threat. "Drink," he said. I lifted the glass, my hands trembling only slightly, and took a cautious sip. It was rich, smooth, the kind of wine that cost more than my rent. He watched my every movement, his expression unreadable. "You intrigue me," he said at last. "Most people look at me and see fear. You looked at me and saw—" "What?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I saw someone I'd just ruined a shirt for." He laughed, genuinely this time, and the sound was disarming, almost human. "Careful," he said, leaning closer. "Humor can be dangerous around me." "Everything's dangerous around you?" I said before I could stop myself. His eyes flickered with something I couldn't name. Approval, maybe, or interest, or something far more dangerous than either. "You're right," he murmured. "But danger isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it's the only thing that reminds us we're alive." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I said nothing. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy, electric, filled with the hum of something unspoken that seemed to vibrate between us, like a taut string waiting to snap. He studied me for so long I began to wonder what he saw. What calculation was turning behind those gray eyes? "You owe me a favor," he said finally, his tone almost casual, though there was nothing casual about the way my heart dropped when I heard it. "What kind of favor?" He smiled faintly. "I haven't decided yet." I stared at him, searching for any hint of jest, but there was none. "So you brought me here just to tell me that?" "I brought you here," he said, his voice dipping lower, softer, "because I wanted to see what kind of woman you were when you were afraid." The words hit me like a physical touch, intimate and invasive all at once. "And what did you see?" I asked quietly. He tilted his head, his gaze moving over my face as though reading something written just beneath the surface. "Someone who doesn't know whether to run or to stay. Someone who's not as innocent as she pretends." Someone who doesn't realize yet that she's already stepped too far inside a world she can't walk out of. My breath caught. You don't know anything about me? He leaned in closer, his voice a low murmur that brushed against my skin like a whisper. Then tell me, Miss Carter. Why didn't you run when you had the chance? I didn't have an answer for that. Not an honest one. The truth was, I didn't know. Maybe it was fear, maybe fascination, maybe something darker, some quiet pull toward the danger I swore I didn't want but couldn't look away from. He smiled, as though he'd already read my silence. That's what I thought. Dinner was a blur after that. He ordered for both of us, steak, rare with sides I barely tasted, and the conversation, if it could even be called that, drifted between small talk and subtle interrogation. He asked about my family, my past, why I'd come to this city, what I wanted. Every question felt like a thread, and by the time dessert arrived, I realized he'd been weaving something out of my answers, something invisible, but unbreakable. When the check came, he didn't even glance at it. He rose from the table, buttoned his jacket, and looked down at me with that same unnerving calm. You're free to go, he said. I blinked, confused. That's it? For tonight, he said, his voice like a warning wrapped in silk. But remember, debts are rarely paid in one sitting. He started to walk away, and I don't know what made me call out after him, but the words slipped out before I could stop them. What happens if I refuse? He turned slightly, the light catching the edge of his face, and for a heartbeat I saw something raw and dangerous flicker behind his composure. Then I'll come find you, he said softly. And trust me, sweetheart, when I do, it won't be for dinner. And with that, he was gone. I sat there long after he left, my untouched wine catching the reflection of the city lights, my pulse still uneven, my thoughts unraveling faster than I could hold them. By the time I stepped outside, the night had shifted, the air colder, sharper, as though it too knew something had changed. The driver was waiting, of course. He didn't need to say a word. I climbed in, numb, silent, lost in thoughts I didn't dare voice. But as the car pulled away, I glanced out the window and saw a black SUV parked across the street, its headlights off, two silhouettes inside watching the restaurant like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. And that was when I realized, whatever game Luca DeLuca had started, I was already a piece on his board, and he wasn't the only one watching me anymore. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it was shallow and restless, the kind of sleep that feels more like drowning than dreaming, where every sound outside your window becomes a threat, and every shadow takes on the shape of something watching you. I kept seeing his face in the dark, the silver gray of his eyes, the faint smirk that wasn't quite cruel but wasn't kind either, the way his voice wrapped around my name like silk dipped in poison. And when I woke to the pale light of morning creeping through the blinds, I realized the feeling hadn't gone away. It had settled somewhere deep beneath my ribs, a quiet, insistent pulse that whispered I'd just stepped into something I didn't understand and couldn't undo. At work, everyone knew. Or at least, they thought they did. The restaurant felt different the moment I walked in. The glances sharper, the whispers quieter, the air thick with curiosity and fear. My manager wouldn't look me in the eye, and when he did, it was with that mixture of pity and warning that people reserve for someone standing too close to a cliff's edge. By the second hour of my shift, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped a plate. And as I bent to pick up the pieces, my coworker Marcy knelt beside me, her perfume sweet but cloying, her voice low and urgent as she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I frowned, trying to laugh it off. "What do you mean? It's just a shift." She looked around, making sure no one was listening. "No, I mean here, as in this place, this job, this city if you can help it." Word gets around fast. You know who you spilled wine on, don't you? I swallowed. I've heard the rumors. Rumors don't do him justice, she said, her eyes wide, her voice trembling just slightly. He owns this city, every street, every cop, every politician who pretends not to know his name. People disappear for less than what you did. He's dangerous, Evie. Stay away from him. Her words sank in like ice water down my spine, and though I wanted to believe she was exaggerating, a small part of me, the part that had seen the way his men moved, the way the world bent quietly around him, knew she wasn't. But danger, I was beginning to learn, had a strange gravity to it. It pulled you closer even as you told yourself to run. The day dragged on, each hour heavier than the last, and by the time my shift ended, my nerves were frayed thin. I left through the up back alley, the shortcut I'd taken 100 times before, my breath fogging in the cold air. The city smelled like rain and smoke, the kind of night that promised storms. I was halfway down the alley when I heard it, the low murmur of voices, sharp and tense, echoing off the brick walls. I stopped, pressing myself against the side of a dumpster, my heart stuttering in my chest. The voices grew clearer, closer. He's getting too comfortable. DeLuca thinks he owns this part of town. He does, another voice said bitterly, but that's about to change. There was a sound like a lighter flicking open, the faint hiss of a cigarette. My pulse spiked. I didn't recognize the voices, but the name, his name, sent a chill through me that rooted me to the spot. His restaurant's a soft spot. He goes there every week. Sooner or later, we'll catch him off guard. My breath caught. They were talking about him, about Luca, and whatever they were planning, it wasn't dinner reservations. I should have turned back, slipped quietly into the night, pretended I hadn't heard a thing. But instead, something reckless inside me, some mixture of fear and adrenaline and something darker I didn't want to name, made me step forward. And of course, the bottle slipped. It clattered against the ground, loud and shattering, the sound slicing through the quiet like a scream. The voices went silent. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then one of them said sharply, "Who's there?" I froze, every instinct screaming run, but my legs wouldn't obey. A beam of light cut through the dark, a flashlight sweeping across the alley until it found me, blinding and harsh. "What the hell?" one of them started, but then something changed. A look, a flicker of recognition, and he hissed, "That's her, the girl from DeLuca's place." Before I could even think, a car engine roared from the street beyond, tires screeching, headlights flooding the narrow alley. The men cursed and scattered, vanishing into the shadows like smoke. The car door opened. Luca stepped out. He wasn't supposed to be there. No one like him belonged in an alley like this, where the air smelled like garbage and danger. But somehow, he looked as if he owned even this darkness. His jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable except for the faint edge of fury that burned low and steady in his eyes. "What the hell were you doing here?" he asked, his voice quiet, calm, the kind of calm that was infinitely worse than shouting. My voice cracked. "I was just leaving work." His gaze swept the alley, the lingering smoke of the men who had fled, then came back to me. "Did they touch you?" "No." He took a step closer, the air around him shifting, heavy with something electric. "Then you were lucky." "I heard them talking," I blurted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. They said they were planning something. For you. At the restaurant." For a moment he said nothing. Then slowly his jaw tightened. "Of course they were." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a phone, murmured something in Italian I couldn't catch, his voice low and lethal. And when he hung up, he looked at me like I was both a problem and a puzzle. "You shouldn't have been here," he said again, softer this time, almost like regret. You could have been killed. Maybe, I said, my voice shaking. But if I hadn't been, you wouldn't have known. That made him pause. For the first time, something flickered behind his composure, something dangerously close to admiration. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the faint trace of cologne and smoke clinging to his shirt, close enough that I could see the faint scar along his jaw I hadn't noticed before. His voice dropped lower, quieter, the kind of whisper that felt like a touch. You don't understand what happens when you step into my world, do you, Evie? I didn't mean to. He smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Nobody ever does. He turned to leave, then stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. I'll have someone watch your place tonight. Don't argue. I wasn't going to. He gave a small nod, as though that answer pleased him, and then he was gone again, the car disappearing into the city like a ghost. I stood there long after he left, my heart hammering, my mind spinning. The alley suddenly too quiet, too still. When I finally made it home, I locked every door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in the dark, trying to convince myself that it was over, that I'd done the right thing, that I wasn't in over my head. But when I looked out the window, I saw it again. A black car idling across the street, its engine silent, its windows tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. It didn't leave. And somehow, I knew it wasn't just his men watching anymore. I should have known it wouldn't end there, that a man like Luca DeLuca didn't leave loose ends, that his world wasn't one where chance encounters faded into memory, and people simply went back to their ordinary lives, because nothing about him was ordinary, and nothing about what had happened between us felt like coincidence. But I still tried to convince myself that maybe somehow it was over. For 2 days I went to work, came home, pretended that the shadows outside my window didn't linger longer than they should have, that the black car parked across the street wasn't always there, that I wasn't waking in the middle of the night to the soft hum of an engine that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Then, on the 3rd night, the knock came. It was soft, polite even, but it carried that same quiet authority I remembered from before, the kind of knock that didn't ask permission. It expected obedience. When I opened the door, there was no driver this time. Instead, there was a man I'd never seen before, tall and well-dressed, his expression neutral, his voice smooth and formal when he said, "Miss Carter, Mr. DeLuca sends his regards." Before I could respond, he held out a black garment bag draped carefully over one arm and an envelope sealed in dark wax that shimmered faintly under the hallway light. "He requests your company for dinner. Tonight." I took the envelope with hands that trembled despite my effort to seem composed. The wax was stamped with an intricate insignia, a serpent coiled around a dagger, elegant and dangerous, the kind of symbol that spoke of lineage and power. The note inside was brief, written in precise, slanted handwriting. "You owe me a dinner. Wear this. Be ready by 8. LD." No threat, no explanation, just the quiet certainty of command. I don't know why I didn't refuse. Maybe it was fear, maybe curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper. Something that had started the night I spilled wine across his chest. Something about the way he had looked at me. Not like I was fragile or foolish, but like I was a question he couldn't stop trying to answer. When I unzipped the garment bag, I forgot to breathe for a moment. The dress inside was black, silk, simple yet devastating. The kind of dress that belonged to another version of myself. Someone bold and dangerous. Someone who knew exactly how much power a single glance could hold. It shimmered faintly under the light, soft as water against my skin when I held it up, and for one dizzy second, I wondered how he knew my size. At 7:58, the car arrived, sleek, silent, the same make as before but driven by someone different, someone whose face I didn't recognize but whose presence carried the same quiet intimidation. As the city lights bled past the windows, My reflection stared back at me. Painted lips, hair pinned loosely, the silk of the dress clinging to me like a second skin. I didn't recognize the woman in the glass. When the car stopped, the driver stepped out, opened the door, and the moment I stepped onto the pavement, I knew this wasn't just a dinner. It was a test. The building loomed above me, all black marble and steel, its entrance guarded by men in suits who didn't need to say who they worked for. Inside, the elevator carried me upward in silence. The soft hum of the machinery, the only sound until the doors opened to reveal a private floor that could only belong to one man. The penthouse was vast, all dark wood and glass. The city stretched out below like a glittering map of secrets. Soft music played somewhere in the background, jazz, low and haunting. And there he was. Standing by the window, glass in hand, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, every inch of him composed and deliberate. The kind of man who didn't have to speak to command attention because everything about him already did. When he turned, his gaze moved over me slowly, deliberately, lingering just long enough to make the air between us feel heavy. "You clean up well," he said finally, his tone light but his eyes far from it. "I wasn't sure what to wear to a dinner that feels like an interrogation," I replied before I could stop myself. He smiled faintly. "Then you chose perfectly." He gestured to the table, a long stretch of polished wood set for two, candles flickering in gold holders, a meal already waiting that looked too exquisite to eat. I took my seat opposite him, and for a moment I could almost pretend it was normal. A dinner between two people who had nothing to fear and nothing to hide. But it wasn't. The silence stretched until I finally said, "You didn't bring me here just to feed me, did you?" He leaned back in his chair, the corner of his mouth twitching. "No, I brought you here because I'm curious." "About what?" "About why you keep walking back into the fire when you've already felt the heat." I looked at him across the table, the candlelight catching in his eyes, and I realized that he wasn't talking about the wine or the dinner, or even the alleyway. He was talking about the pull between us, the dangerous magnetic current that neither of us could seem to ignore. "Maybe I don't know how to stay away," I said softly. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying the admission. Honesty, I wasn't expecting that. "I'm too tired to lie." "Good," he said, his smile sharp now. "Lies are a waste of time." Dinner passed in a blur of quiet questions and lingering glances. He asked about my life again, where I grew up, what I wanted, who I trusted, and though I tried to keep my answers guarded, I found myself saying more than I should have. Drawn in by the rhythm of his voice, by the way he listened like every word mattered, like I was the only person in the world speaking. At one point, he poured me another glass of wine, the same deep red I had spilled on him that first night, and when I hesitated, he said, "You're not afraid of repeating history, are you?" "Should I be?" He smiled, the kind of smile that made it impossible to look away. "Only if you don't plan to survive it." I should have left then. I should have stood up, thanked him, walked out, pretended this was just another strange encounter in a city full of them. But I didn't move. When dessert came, untouched and forgotten between us, he rose from his chair and circled the table slowly until he stood beside me. His presence was overwhelming. His scent, his warmth, the faint scrape of his shoes against the floor. "Stand up," he said quietly. My pulse stuttered, but I obeyed. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from my face, his fingers brushing a loose strand of hair behind my ear. "You're shaking," he murmured. "I'm not," I lied, though my voice betrayed me. He leaned in, close enough that I could feel the whisper of his breath against my skin, and said, "You should be." There was no threat in his tone, only certainty, the kind that came from a man who knew exactly what kind of danger he was, and exactly how much someone like me might crave it. He stepped back, his expression returning to that same unreadable calm. "I'll take you home," he said simply, as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just turned my heartbeat into a weapon. The drive back was silent, the city outside a blur of lights and rain. When the car stopped in front of my building, he didn't look at me right away. "You should stay out of dark alleys," he said softly, "and away from men like me." I met his gaze, my voice barely above a whisper. "Then why do you keep finding me?" He didn't answer. He just smiled, slow and knowing, and said, "Because you haven't stopped thinking about me either." And then he was gone, the car disappearing into the night like smoke. I stood there for a long time, the echo of his words tangled in my chest, the city alive around me, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. When I finally looked up, I saw a figure standing in the shadows across the street, watching me. Not one of his men this time. Someone else. Someone waiting. And that was when I realized the game had only just begun. It's strange how quickly fear becomes familiar, how it settles into the rhythm of your days until it stops feeling like panic and starts feeling like presence, a constant shadow that walks beside you, whispering reminders that safety is an illusion you no longer deserve. In the days that followed that dinner, I carried Luca De Luca's name inside me like a secret flame, one that both warmed and burned, that made my pulse quicken for reasons I didn't want to understand. I told myself I could forget him, that it had only been dinner, a dangerous flirtation with something far beyond me. But every night I found myself glancing toward the street, searching for the sleek black car that had become as much a part of my life as the ticking of the clock in my tiny apartment. He didn't call. He didn't send for me. And somehow that made it worse, because I knew he was out there, waiting, watching, deciding. It was a Thursday when everything cracked. The restaurant was busier than usual, the kind of night where the noise and light blur into a dizzying hum. And for a few hours, I almost felt normal again. Until I saw them. Two men at a corner table, dressed too sharply for coincidence, their attention fixed not on the menu but on the entrance, their movements too deliberate to be casual. I'd learned enough to notice details now, the way their eyes flicked to each newcomer, the small bulge under one man's jacket that could only be a gun, the restless tap of a finger on glass that sounded like impatience disguised as calm. Something inside me tightened. When Luca walked in, the air shifted. He wasn't supposed to be there. He never announced his presence, never appeared twice in the same place, unless it was calculated. But the moment I saw him, I understood. This was his place too. The restaurant might have belonged to someone else on paper, but in truth, everything in this part of the city belonged to him. He took his usual seat, the same one as that first night, as though the past had folded in on itself, bringing us both back to where it started. His eyes met mine for only a heartbeat, but that was all it took for the chaos around me to fade into background noise. And then, as I turned to leave his table, I saw the man at the corner reach into his jacket. The world slowed. There was no warning, no shout, no chance to think. Just the flash of metal, the deafening crack of a gunshot, the scream that tore through the air, sharp and high and too close to be anyone else's. I don't know when I dropped the tray. I don't know how I ended up on the floor, wine and glass and blood painting the tiles in a surreal collage. I only know that when I looked up, Luca was already moving, faster than I thought possible, calm in the chaos, death in motion. The man with the gun fired again, but Luca was on him before the sound had even died. The fight was brutal, precise, a blur of violence that felt almost choreographed. His men appeared from nowhere, drawn to him like shadows, and within seconds it was over. The attacker lay crumpled against the wall, blood pooling beneath him, his eyes wide with the realization that he'd aimed at a king and missed. Luca stood over him, his shirt torn, a streak of blood across his temple that wasn't his own. His expression was calm, detached, almost bored. He said something in Italian I couldn't catch, and one of his men nodded, pulling the broken man to his feet before dragging him out the back. The restaurant was silent again, eerily, impossibly silent. I was still on the floor, my hands sticky with spilled wine that looked too much like blood, my chest heaving. He turned to me then, his eyes finding mine, and for the first time I saw something beneath that cold composure, something fierce and human and raw. He crossed the space between us in 3 long strides and knelt, his hand reaching out to touch my face, his fingers surprisingly gentle against my skin. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, but the movement felt detached, my body moving without permission. He's taken care of," Luca said simply, as if that ended the conversation, as if violence was just another language he spoke fluently. Someone brought him a towel and he wiped his hands clean, each movement deliberate, methodical, almost ritualistic. Then he stood, offering me his hand. "You shouldn't be here anymore." It wasn't a suggestion. I took his hand anyway, because there was no part of me that could say no. He led me out through the back, where the night air hit me like a slap, sharp and cold. I could still hear the faint sounds from inside, the staff whispering, the low hum of fear. But out here, the world felt strangely still. He turned to me, the streetlight catching the line of his jaw, the faint bruise blooming along his cheekbone. "You see now," he said softly, "what kind of man I am." There was no pride in his voice, no apology either, just the simple, devastating truth of it. "I didn't ask for this," I said, my voice shaking. "Any of this." He stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "No. But you didn't walk away either." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that I'd tried, that I hadn't asked for his world to bleed into mine. But the words tangled in my throat. Because somewhere deep down, I knew he wasn't wrong. I hadn't run. I'd stayed. He reached into his pocket then and pulled out a folded handkerchief, pressing it into my hand. It was silk, still warm from his touch, embroidered with that same serpent and dagger crest. "You saved my life the other night," he said, "when you warned me. Consider tonight my repayment." I shook my head, confusion warring with fear. "That's not how this works." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "No, it's not. But I'm trying to be generous." He turned as if to leave, then paused, his gaze flicking toward something behind me. That was when I heard it. A noise, faint but unmistakable, coming from the alley beyond the restaurant. A groan, a scuffle, the sound of someone being dragged. "Stay here," he said, but I didn't. I followed him, my feet moving before my mind could catch up, until I saw what lay at the end of the alley. The man who had tried to shoot him, barely conscious, bloodied, held upright by one of Luca's men. Luca's voice was calm when he spoke, almost conversational. "You pointed a gun at me. That's not something a man walks away from." The attacker tried to speak, his voice wet with blood. "Please, I didn't..." The shot came quick, efficient, final. I flinched, the sound echoing in my bones. Luca turned back to me, his eyes dark in the dim light. "Now you really know," he said quietly. "There's no walking away from this. Not for him. Not for you." For a long moment we just stood there, the night pressing in around us, the silence heavier than any scream. Then he stepped closer, his hand lifting to cup my face again, his thumb brushing the corner of my mouth like he could erase what I'd just seen. "Go home, Evie," he murmured, "and forget what you saw." But we both knew I wouldn't. When I got home that night, I sat in the dark, his handkerchief still clutched in my palm, the faint scent of smoke and wine clinging to it. My reflection in the window looked like someone else entirely, a woman standing at the edge of something vast and terrible, unable to look away. And as the city outside pulsed with distant sirens and quiet sin, I realized something that terrified me far more than the gunfire or the blood. I wasn't afraid of Luca DeLuca anymore. I was afraid of what I was becoming because of him. The days that followed blurred together, each one dripping slowly into the next, thick with the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but suffocates, a silence that fills your ears until it becomes its own kind of noise, a whisper reminding you that something inside you has shifted, that the world has changed its shape, and you haven't yet figured out how to live inside it. I tried to pretend life was normal, that I could return to work, smile at customers, carry trays, and scrub away the crimson stain that kept flashing behind my eyelids no matter how hard I tried to forget. But it was useless. Every time the door opened, I half expected to see him standing there again, half shadow and command, every inch of him a reminder of the moment I crossed from safety into something far more dangerous and far more alive. But it wasn't him who came first. It was his men. They appeared in quiet corners and dim reflections, never close enough to speak but never far enough to forget. 2 or 3 of them at a time, scattered around the restaurant like dark punctuation marks in a sentence only I could read. At first, I told myself it was paranoia, that maybe my mind was turning every suited man into a ghost of his world. But then one of them, tall, silent, familiar, placed an envelope on the counter before leaving without a word, and I knew the illusion had never been mine to control. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, sealed with that same black serpent pressed into the wax. Inside was a note written in Luca's slanted handwriting, precise and elegant, like everything about him. You shouldn't be waiting tables anymore. Come to me tonight. We'll discuss something better. LD. I sat there for a long time staring at those words, my heart thudding unevenly, because the message wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision already made, a command dressed up as concern. And though part of me bristled at the arrogance of it, another part, quieter and far more dangerous, felt a strange relief. Because maybe, finally, I didn't have to keep pretending to live in a world that no longer wanted me. When I arrived at the address he'd written, a club downtown I'd never noticed before, its name spelled in small gold letters that caught the light like secrets, I half expected to be turned away. But the moment I stepped inside, everything changed. The place was beautiful in that deliberate, dangerous way Luca seemed to orchestrate everything. Dark velvet and low lights, the air heavy with the scent of expensive liquor, and the faintest trace of smoke. Music pulsing low and slow, not enough to dance to, but enough to feel beneath your skin. Every table, every shadow seemed to hum with power, and yet there was a kind of elegance to it, a discipline, as if chaos itself bowed to him here. I found him in a corner booth, surrounded by men who stopped talking the moment they saw me. He was leaning back, a glass in hand, his shirt unbuttoned just enough to reveal the suggestion of a scar along his collarbone, a mark that somehow made him look more human and more untouchable all at once. Evie, he said when I reached him, my name curling out of his mouth like smoke, and for a moment the sound of it felt like gravity itself, pulling me down to where he wanted me. Sit. I did. He dismissed the others with a single nod, and they vanished, leaving us alone in the soft dimness, the low light catching on the ring he wore, a simple silver band that somehow looked like a weapon. I didn't ask you to come here, I said finally, my voice low, too aware of how small it sounded against the weight of his presence. He smiled faintly. No. But you came anyway. I came because you asked. Same thing. I wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't, that choice and command weren't the same, but the words died on my tongue because deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze locked on mine. You saved my life once, and then I saved yours. That means something. It doesn't have to mean anything. Oh, but it does, he said softly. In my world, debts and favors are currency, and I don't like owing anyone anything. Which means I need to find you a place where you can earn what you're already part of. I stared at him, trying to make sense of the words that didn't sound like a proposal so much as a verdict. What are you saying? I'm saying you shouldn't be wasting your time taking orders from people who aren't worth your apology, he said, his tone even but laced with that quiet authority that made refusal feel like blasphemy. I own this club, among other things. I need someone I can trust here. Someone who doesn't flinch when things get dark. I'm not one of your people, Luca. He smiled at that, the kind of slow, knowing smile that made it clear he thought otherwise. You keep telling yourself that. I don't belong in your world. Maybe, he murmured, swirling the wine in his glass. But my world has already found you. You think the people who came for me that night don't know who you are now? You think they wouldn't use you to get to me? You're already marked, Evie. The only difference now is whether you want to survive it or not. His words hit me harder than I wanted them to. It wasn't a threat. It was truth. So what? Working for you makes me safe? I asked, though my voice betrayed me, trembling despite the calm I tried to wear like armor. Safer than pretending you can stay invisible, he said simply. You can work the front of the club, keep books, help with clients. Nothing you can't handle. You'll have protection. You'll have control. And you'll have me. There it was. The quiet seduction in the last 3 words. The promise hidden beneath the danger. I should have said no. Every instinct told me to run, to burn the note, to disappear. But instead I heard myself whisper, "And if I say yes?" He smiled, slow and sharp, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Then you'll learn what loyalty feels like, and what it costs. The next days came with new rules. No more shifts at the restaurant. No more cheap uniforms or apologies. No more pretending to be someone who didn't know what blood looked like when it hit the floor. Luca sent someone to deliver keys, a sleek black card, and a warning. You start Monday. Working at the club was like walking through smoke. Everything glittered and shimmered. But underneath it all was something dangerous and alive. Something that hummed beneath the laughter and music like the steady beat of a heart that never slept. The men who came there wore smiles sharp enough to cut, and the women who served them looked at me with a kind of knowing pity, as if they'd all made the same choice once. And yet, I didn't hate it. There was power here. A quiet kind I'd never known before. The way people moved when Luca entered a room, the way the air changed, the way he would glance at me from across the floor with a look that made my pulse stumble. It was intoxicating. Late one night after closing, I found him standing on the balcony overlooking the city, the lights below stretching endlessly, the skyline burning faintly gold beneath the mist. I joined him, the silence between us thick and alive. He didn't turn when he said, "You're still thinking about running." I'd be stupid not to. He smiled faintly, though his gaze remained on the city. Maybe, but you won't. How can you be so sure? He looked at me then, really looked, and said, "Because you're not afraid of me anymore." He was right. And that terrified me more than anything else ever had. It had been almost 2 weeks since I started working at Luca's club, though time there didn't move like it did anywhere else. It pulsed, it stretched, it shimmered, and sometimes it disappeared entirely, swallowed whole by the strange rhythm of that place, where laughter sounded like secrets, and every glass clink felt like the beginning of a deal that would end in blood. I was beginning to understand the quiet choreography of it all. The glances exchanged between men who never said each other's names, the way a smile could be a warning, the way silence could carry more weight than words ever could. And through it all, I could feel him, Luca, like a shadow threaded through every hour, invisible yet always there, watching, waiting, pulling at something inside me I didn't want to name. He didn't come to the club every night, but when he did, the atmosphere changed, as if the building itself exhaled, like the walls recognized their master. People straightened their posture, lowered their voices, and I felt my pulse shift in my throat. Not because I feared him anymore, but because I knew what his presence meant. It meant that, no matter how hard I tried to build walls around myself, he would find a way to slip through the cracks, effortlessly, without asking, without needing permission. Because everything about him was built to take and to own and to consume. That night the rain had been steady since dusk, streaking down the tall glass windows, blurring the city lights into something liquid and dreamlike. The music was softer than usual, the crowd thinner, the air heavy with something unspoken. I was behind the bar, pretending to focus on the bottles, pretending I didn't notice the way he had been watching me from the mezzanine for the past hour. His expression unreadable, his hand resting against the railing like he owned not just the room, but the night itself. When he finally descended the stairs, every nerve in my body seemed to wake at once. He crossed the floor slowly, with the kind of deliberate grace that came from knowing he never had to rush for anyone. He didn't speak when he reached the bar, just nodded slightly toward the back hallway, a silent order wrapped in quiet control. I followed, even though I told myself I wouldn't. The hallway was dim, lined with mirrors that caught our reflections in flashes of gold and shadow. He led me into his office, a room that smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and something distinctly him. The door shut behind me with a soft, final click that sounded far too much like fate. He turned then, his eyes tracing me in a way that made my breath stumble. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice calm, low, the kind of tone that could make a confession sound like a command. "I've been working." He tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Working," he repeated, as though the word itself amused him. "You're learning quickly. I can see it." I crossed my arms, though it felt like holding up paper against a storm. "If you brought me here to compliment my work ethic, you're wasting both our time." That made him laugh, softly, a sound that shouldn't have been as dangerous as it was. "You're the only one in this building who speaks to me like that." "Maybe that's why you keep me around," I said, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. Though beneath the sharpness there was something else. Something that trembled. He stepped closer, slowly, until there was only a breath between us. "Maybe," he murmured, and the words seemed to curl against my skin like a touch. "Or maybe it's because I like watching you pretend you're not affected." I should have walked away. I should have laughed, deflected, reminded him of the line between employer and employee, between danger and desire. But my body refused to move, caught in the gravitational pull of his proximity. He smelled like rain and whiskey, and beneath that, something darker. Something that made me think of fire caught beneath glass. "You think I'm pretending?" I asked, though the question came out softer than I intended, more like an invitation than defiance. "I think," he said, his voice barely a whisper now, "that you keep standing this close to me because you want to know what will happen if you stop pretending." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed, alive, heavy with all the things we hadn't said. My heart was beating too fast, too loud, and when I looked up, his gaze was already fixed on my mouth, that faint, dangerous half-smile fading into something else entirely, something raw. And then he kissed me. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't careful, it was inevitable. His hand slid up to the back of my neck, his fingers threading through my hair, his mouth finding mine with a force that stole my breath, like he'd been waiting for this moment since the night I'd spilled wine across his chest, like he'd known from the beginning that no matter how far I tried to run, this was where I would end up. I should have pushed him away, but instead I moved closer, my hands gripping the fabric of his shirt, feeling the steady thrum of his pulse beneath my palms, the warmth of his body pressing against mine. The kiss deepened, dark and consuming, and for a moment I forgot everything. The danger, the fear, the rules. There was only the taste of him, the sound of our breaths tangled in the quiet, the way he exhaled my name like a prayer and a curse at once. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine, his breath rough, uneven, his voice low enough to shatter me when he whispered, "This is exactly why I told you to run." "Then why didn't you let me?" I asked, my voice trembling but steady enough to make him look at me again, those gray eyes burning with something I couldn't name. He didn't answer right away. He just smiled, a tired, dangerous smile that said more than words ever could. "Because I wanted to see what would happen if you stayed." The air between us felt electric, charged with something both beautiful and terrible. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run before it was too late. But my body betrayed me, leaning into the quiet gravity of him, the pull I couldn't deny. He stepped back, finally, dragging a hand through his hair as if trying to collect himself, and said, "This doesn't change anything." "It changes everything," I said softly, because we both knew it did. He turned away, his voice colder now, more measured, the mask slipping back into place. "Go home, Evie, before I forget I'm trying to protect you." I wanted to argue, to ask what he meant, to tell him that the danger wasn't just his anymore, it was mine too. But the words caught in my throat. I left instead, though my legs felt weak beneath me, though the sound of his voice still lingered in the air like a ghost. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the world still felt drenched, gleaming under the streetlights. The city was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that hides things. I walked faster, my pulse still racing from something I couldn't name, until I turned the corner near my building, and froze. A car I didn't recognize sat idling by the curb, its headlights off, its windows tinted black. For a moment I thought it might be Luca's, another one of his men sent to make sure I made it home safely. But then I saw the shadow behind the wheel, the glint of something metallic catching the streetlight, and I knew it wasn't one of his. It was someone else. Someone watching. Someone waiting. And in that instant, standing there with my heart still echoing his kiss against my lips, I realized that the danger wasn't just tied to Luca anymore. It had followed me, found me, claimed me. And whoever was in that car had no intention of letting me forget it. The night after the kiss, I couldn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't, and that more than anything terrified me. The memory of his mouth on mine played in endless loops inside my head, tangled with the taste of wine and rain and something I couldn't name. A hunger, maybe, or something darker, something that felt like surrender. I lay there staring at the ceiling, every heartbeat echoing with his voice, every breath a reminder that I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It wasn't just the kiss itself, it was the way it had made everything else disappear, how the rest of the world had blurred until there was only him. But in the morning, reality found me again. It always does. It came not as panic, but as stillness. The kind of quiet you feel before a storm breaks. I got up, dressed, went to the club as if nothing had changed, though everything had. People smiled, nodded, the music played, the glasses clinked, and beneath it all I could feel something off, something wrong, like a note struck just slightly out of tune. Luca wasn't there that day. He'd been called away, or at least that's what one of his men said when I asked. A man named Rafe, who smiled too easily and watched me too closely. "Business," he said, shrugging, his voice smooth and empty. "He'll be back soon." The words should have comforted me, but they didn't. There was something in the way Rafe looked at me. Something knowing, assessing, as if he was weighing what I was worth. And not in the way a man appraises a woman, but the way a soldier measures the value of a pawn. That feeling followed me all day, clinging to my skin like the scent of smoke. Every sound made me jump. Every unfamiliar face made my heart stumble. I tried to shake it off, to remind myself that I was safe, that Luca's world was dangerous but controlled, that he would never let harm come near me. But as the night deepened and the rain began again, soft, steady, whispering against the windows, I realized how naive that thought was. Because Luca wasn't here, and I had no idea who really was. I was closing out the register near midnight when the lights flickered, just once, just long enough to make the air feel colder, heavier. I looked up, half expecting one of the regulars to be standing there, but the room was empty. Everyone else had gone home. It was just me and the soft hum of the cooling systems and the faint scent of whiskey lingering in the air. Then I heard it, a click behind me, the unmistakable sound of a door closing where no door should have been. "Luca?" I called, though my voice betrayed me, trembling on the edges of hope and dread. No answer. When I turned, Rafe was standing there, his suit immaculate, his smile small and wrong, like a blade polished too bright. "What are you doing here?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound calm, even though every nerve in my body screamed that something was very, very wrong. "Just making sure everything's locked up," he said. But his tone didn't match the words, and when he stepped closer, I noticed the gun tucked beneath his jacket, the way his hand brushed it like a habit. "Luca's been distracted lately. I'm here to take care of a few loose ends." My stomach turned. What kind of loose ends? He smiled again, and this time there was no mistaking it. It was the kind of smile men wear before they do something unforgivable. "You, sweetheart." Before I could react, before I could even reach for the phone, something sharp pressed against my ribs, and his voice dropped to a whisper so calm it almost didn't sound human. "Now, let's not make this harder than it has to be." The world spun after that, a blur of motion and panic and cold. I remember the rain, the rough fabric against my face as they dragged me outside, the sound of an engine, the smell of exhaust and fear. Someone tied my wrists, someone else laughed, and through it all I could hear my own heartbeat pounding like a desperate drum inside my chest. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. When the blindfold finally came off, I was somewhere dark and damp, the air thick with the metallic scent of rust and old water. A warehouse, maybe. My chair was metal, my ankles bound, my wrists aching from the ropes. And Rafe was there, leaning against a pillar, smoking. "You really thought he cared about you, didn't you?" he said, exhaling a slow stream of smoke that caught the light from a single hanging bulb. "You really thought the great Luca de Luca would risk everything for a waitress?" "He'll come for me," I said, the words out before I could stop them, but they sounded too thin, too fragile even to my own ears. He laughed quietly. "Oh, he'll come. That's the point." I froze. "What?" Rafe smiled, flicking ash onto the floor. "You're bait, sweetheart. The boss has been getting too comfortable, too human. We can't touch him in his fortress, not with all those men and guns, but you." He gestured toward me with his cigarette. "You make him vulnerable. You're the one thing that'll bring him to his knees." My blood went cold. The realization hit me so hard it took my breath away. They weren't from another family. They weren't rivals. They were his, men who worked for him, men who had turned against him. And I was the weapon they planned to use. "You won't get away with this," I said, but the words came out hollow, stripped of conviction. He stepped closer, crouched down beside me, his hand brushing a strand of hair from my face in a mockery of tenderness. "You really don't get it, do you? This isn't personal. You're just leverage." He straightened and nodded towards someone behind me. I heard the creak of boots, the metallic scrape of a door, and then footsteps receding into the dark. I sat there, my pulse roaring in my ears, my thoughts spinning. I should have felt only fear, but somewhere beneath it was something else. Anger. Sharp and hot. Directed not at them, but at Luca. Because if I was here, it was because of him. Because of the choices he made. Because he had dragged me into this world and told me I'd be safe when he knew I wouldn't be. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it. The distant growl of engines outside. The unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel. The faint, echoing sound of doors slamming. Rafe's expression changed. He looked toward the entrance, his hand moving to his gun. "Already?" he muttered. "That was faster than I thought." The door burst open before he could finish the sentence. The first shot shattered the silence, followed by another, then another. The lights flickered. Shouts erupted, chaos filling the air like thunder. I ducked instinctively, my heart in my throat, every sound sharp and deafening. When the gunfire stopped, the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. And then, through the haze, I saw him. Luca, emerging from the darkness like something carved from it, his gun still raised, his expression unreadable except for the quiet, terrifying fury burning in his eyes. He didn't look at me right away. He stepped over the bodies first, methodical, unhurried, like death itself taking its time. Then his gaze found mine, and for a moment the world shrank to that single point of connection. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough, his hand already reaching for me. I shook my head, though I could barely breathe. "Your men, Rafe," he said. "I know," he said softly, cutting me off, his tone a strange mix of steel and regret. I should have seen it coming. He untied me, his fingers brushing mine, and though his touch was gentle, there was something haunted in the way he moved, like a man carrying too many ghosts. When I stood, my legs gave out, and he caught me, his arms strong around me, holding me upright as the warehouse burned behind us. The flames caught the edges of the night, and for a moment it looked like the world itself was on fire. As we stepped into the rain, the smell of smoke clinging to our clothes, I looked up at him and saw the truth written in his face. He wasn't angry because I'd been taken. He was angry because they'd used me to get to him. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. I wasn't just in his world anymore. I was part of it. The warehouse fire still burns behind my eyes when I close them, a blaze that feels less like memory and more like something branded into me. A heat that lives beneath my skin. A reminder that I should have died there. That I probably would have if he hadn't come. Even now, days later, I can smell it. The smoke, the gunpowder, the faint tang of blood that clung to the air long after the rain tried to wash it away. And I can still hear it too. The echo of gunfire in my head. The low, dangerous timbre of Luca's voice when he said my name, like it was both an apology and a promise he didn't know how to keep. He brought me to his home that night, or his fortress as it felt to me, a sprawling mansion tucked away from the city, wrapped in iron gates and guarded silence. I remember the way the car moved through the darkness, the hum of the engine blending with the sound of my heartbeat, how I sat there staring out the window, unable to speak, unable to even look at him, because I didn't know if what I felt was gratitude or fear, or something else entirely. He didn't speak much either. When we arrived, he led me inside, through halls that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, past portraits of men whose eyes all seemed to follow you, until we reached a room at the far end. A guest room, though nothing about it felt ordinary. The sheets were white, the fire already lit, the air too warm after the cold outside. He told me to rest, that I was safe now. But when he turned to leave, I grabbed his wrist without thinking. My voice barely more than a whisper when I said, "Don't go." He looked at me for a long moment, and in his eyes I saw something I'd never seen before. Not control, not confidence, but exhaustion. The kind that comes from carrying too much for too long. He didn't say anything, didn't promise me comfort or protection or love. He just nodded once, quietly, and stayed. I don't know when I fell asleep, only that when I woke, the world was dim again. The fire burned lower, and Luca was still there, sitting in a chair by the window, his jacket draped over the armrest, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, the soft light tracing the sharp lines of his face. For a moment, I thought maybe I was dreaming, that this was another illusion conjured by exhaustion. But then his eyes opened, finding mine immediately, like he'd been awake the whole time, watching. "You should eat," he said quietly, his voice hoarse, softer than I'd ever heard it. "I'm not hungry," I replied, though that wasn't true. Hunger wasn't the problem. It was everything else. Every thought. Every emotion. Pressing down on me until I didn't know what to do with them. He stood, slow and deliberate, and walked toward me. There was something heavy about the way he moved, like he was carrying the weight of what he'd done. "You shouldn't have been there," he said. "You shouldn't have been part of any of this." "I told you that weeks ago," I said, my voice trembling more from the truth of it than the cold. "But you didn't listen." His jaw tightened, but his expression didn't change. "I tried to protect you." "By pulling me closer?" I snapped, the anger surprising even me, sharp and sudden and alive. "By dragging me into your world and then acting like you had no idea this would happen?" He exhaled slowly, his eyes darkening. Not with anger, but something heavier. Guilt, maybe. "If I could undo it, I would." "Would you?" I asked, and when he didn't answer, I pressed. "If you could go back to that night at the restaurant, to the moment I spilled wine on you, would you let me walk away?" He didn't hesitate this time. "No." The word cut through the air like glass shattering. "No?" I repeated, incredulous. "No," he said again, quieter now, but there was no apology in it, only conviction. "I wouldn't change it. Because as much as I hate what it's cost you, I can't lie to myself and say I don't want you here." His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true, because I felt the same way and hated myself for it. I wanted to hate him for the chaos he brought into my life, for the danger that now felt like a shadow stitched to my skin. But I couldn't, because every time he looked at me, I remembered the way it felt when his lips met mine, the way the world fell away, the way fear turned into something else entirely. I stood, my hands trembling, my voice low and furious when I said, "You think wanting me makes it okay? You think that just because you saved me, I belong to you now?" Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, anger, restraint. But his tone stayed calm. Too calm. "No, I think saving you means I can't let you go." "Then what am I, Luca?" I demanded, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "What am I to you? A debt you couldn't pay off? A weakness you can't admit? Or just another thing you control because you don't know how to feel anything without owning it?" He took a step toward me, his voice dropping low. "You think I don't feel anything? You think I don't wake up every night hearing the sound of that gunshot, wondering if I would have made it in time, if I'd had to find you in a morgue instead of alive? Then why keep me here?" I whispered. "Why not let me go?" "Because they'll come for you again," he said, his voice suddenly hard, the mask slipping back into place. "Because Rafe wasn't the only one. Because you're marked now, Evie. Because the moment you walked into my world, there was No way out. His words hit me harder than the cold, harder than the fear. I stared at him, and for the first time I saw the truth. Not the myth, not the legend, not the Mafia king who owned everything he touched, but the man beneath it all, the one who knew he destroyed the things he loved and couldn't stop himself anyway. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but all I could do was stand there, breathing hard, caught between anger and longing, love and hate, light and shadow. When he reached for me, I flinched, not because I feared him, but because I feared myself, because if he touched me, I wouldn't resist. "Don't," I said, stepping back. "Don't make this harder." He froze, his hand still halfway between us, his expression breaking for just a moment. It was never supposed to be easy. We stared at each other then, and it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then suddenly, the sound of shattering glass tore through the silence. Luca's head snapped toward the window. Before I could even register what was happening, he was on me, grabbing me by the arm and pulling me to the floor just as a bullet ripped through the room, splintering the wall where my head had been seconds before. "Get down!" he shouted, his voice sharp, commanding, the calm gone, replaced by pure, deadly focus. The lights went out, plunging us into darkness. More shots followed. 3, 4, 5, each one louder than the last, echoing through the hall like thunder. Somewhere outside, I heard engines, tires skidding, men shouting in Italian. Luca pulled me close, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered, "They found us." My heart stopped. "Who?" He looked at me, eyes hard and unflinching even in the dark. "Everyone." There are moments when the world slows, when sound itself seems to stretch thin and fragile, when breath becomes something you have to remind yourself to take. And in that suspended space between heartbeat and chaos, everything feels both infinite and ending. That's what it felt like when the bullets started flying. Like time had decided to hold its breath. Like the universe was watching to see who would fall first. Luca moved with a kind of grace that didn't belong to mortals, his body instinctively placing itself between me and the window. His gun drawn in one smooth motion, the darkness flashing with bursts of light every time he fired. I remember the sound of shattering glass, the acrid taste of gunpowder in the air, the way his hand found mine even as he shouted for me to stay down, as if part of him couldn't stop reaching for me, even now, even in the middle of hell. When the noise finally broke, it broke all at once. A crash, a scream, footsteps pounding, the metallic click of another magazine being loaded, and somewhere in the distance the low wail of sirens that meant nothing in a place like this. I could feel his heartbeat through his grip, could feel how steady it was, how measured, like he'd lived through 1,000 nights just like this one. But I hadn't. I was shaking, gasping, every nerve alive and on fire, every part of me screaming that I didn't belong here. Not in this storm of violence and loyalty and love twisted into something unrecognizable. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm, controlled, as if control was the only thing keeping the world from collapsing around him. But then there was another sound, the unmistakable creak of the front door, and I saw them through the smoke. Men, armed, dressed in black, faces hidden behind masks that looked more like shadows than flesh. The traitors, the ones who had turned against him. He fired first, his movements precise and merciless, but there were too many. The room lit up in flashes of gunfire, and all I could do was crawl behind the overturned table, covering my ears, praying to a god I didn't even believe in, that the next bullet wouldn't find me. At some point, someone grabbed me, a hand rough on my arm, dragging me across the floor, and before I could even scream, Luca was there, pulling me back, his voice a low growl of fury that didn't sound human. The shot came then, loud and close, and the man who had touched me fell before he could take another breath. For a moment, everything went still again. The smoke settled. The gunfire stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. And then I saw it. Luca, standing over the fallen men, his gun still raised, his body tense, his breath sharp, and the blood. Not theirs. His. It took me a second to understand what I was seeing, to realize that the dark stain spreading across his shirt wasn't from someone else. He looked down at it like it was an inconvenience, something he could shake off. But the way he staggered, the way his hand pressed to his side told a different story. "Luca," I whispered, my voice breaking on his name as I stumbled toward him, catching him just before he could fall. He smiled then, faint and almost tender, like a man remembering something beautiful. "It's nothing," he said, but his voice was too soft, too far away. I pressed my hands to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but there was too much of it, warm and slick beneath my fingers, and the smell of iron filled the air like a curse. "Don't you dare!" I said, my voice shaking, my tears falling onto his skin. "Don't you dare leave me, not after everything." His hand came up then, slow and trembling, brushing a strand of hair from my face, his touch gentle in a way it had never been before, as if the violence had finally burned away everything else. "You should go," he murmured. "You shouldn't have to see this." "I'm not going anywhere," I said, and for once I meant it with every piece of me. "You don't get to decide that." He laughed softly, the sound catching on a breath that wasn't steady. "You never listened, did you?" "Maybe that's why you kept me around," I said, forcing a smile through the tears. "Someone had to argue with you." He looked at me then, really looked, and in that gaze was everything we had never said. The anger, the desire, the pain, the impossible love that had built itself between us in the shadows. "You were never supposed to stay," he whispered. "But I did," I said, "and I'm not leaving now." He tried to say something else, but his breath hitched, and I could see the fight draining out of him, see the light flickering behind his eyes. The men who had attacked us were gone now, or dead, or fleeing, I didn't care. All I could see was him. I pressed my forehead against his, my voice breaking as I said, "Luca, please." For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the rain outside, soft and relentless, tapping against the shattered glass like a heartbeat that refused to stop. And then he spoke again, his voice barely more than a breath. "You changed everything," he said. "You made me remember what it felt like to want something that wasn't power." I didn't know what to say, so I just held him tighter. The warmth of his blood seeping into my clothes, my tears mixing with the rain that fell through the broken window. When the sirens grew louder, I realized I didn't even know who had called them. His men, maybe, or the neighbors who'd finally stopped pretending not to hear. It didn't matter. The sound felt distant, irrelevant, like it belonged to another world entirely. He looked at me one last time, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. "You spilled wine on my suit," he murmured, his voice fading like the last line of a story. And I never recovered from it. Then he went still. For a moment I refused to believe it. I kept calling his name, shaking him, begging him to open his eyes, but he didn't. The silence that followed was absolute. The kind of silence that swallows you whole, that makes you understand what it means to lose something you can never get back. When they took him away, I didn't speak. I couldn't. The house smelled of smoke and blood and memory, and I sat there on the floor until the sun began to rise, until the light started to creep across the broken glass, turning everything gold and cruelly beautiful. People asked me later why I stayed, why I didn't run when I had the chance, why I let myself be pulled into a world that would never belong to me. I told them I didn't know. But the truth is, I do. Because sometimes you meet someone who becomes a mirror, someone who shows you the parts of yourself you didn't want to see, someone who breaks you open and makes you whole all at once. And even if it destroys you, even if it ends in fire and silence and blood, you can't bring yourself to regret it. Luca was that for me. He was chaos and control, sin and salvation, the storm and the shelter. And though the world calls him a monster, I know better. He was the man who looked at me, like I wasn't invisible. The man who touched me like I was something fragile worth holding. The man who taught me that love doesn't always save you. Sometimes it burns you alive, and you love it anyway. Now, when I walk by the old restaurant, the place where it all began, the city feels quieter, the world a little slower. I stop sometimes, look through the window, and in the reflection I almost see him. His suit, his smile, the ghost of that moment frozen forever in time. And though I'll never see him again, though the world has moved on, and the silence between us has become eternal, I carry him with me still, in the scent of rain, in the taste of red wine, in the echo of his voice when the night grows too quiet. Because some stories don't end when the last page turns. Some stories stay with you, whispering in the dark, reminding you that love, real love, isn't about survival at all. It's about surrender.